Hello students. Today we will discuss another topic is called isolation. Is the one of the special topic for making or creation or formation of new species. So here this isolation is nothing but segregation of a particular population, right? Segregation of population by some barriers, but these barriers which prevents the process of interbreeding. So these interbreeding which can finally creates the development of new species. So here it is the major common definition for isolation. Actually here the isolation is nothing but separation or segregation of a particular population by various type of barriers, either it is a physiological barriers or mechanical barriers, geographical or ethological. So whatever it may be, finally which are prevents the process of interbreeding. It can creates the, or it can more convenient for the development of new species. At the same time here this isolation, right? So this isolation is the first step for the development for new species. And again this isolation, so means here the particular population, it should be split into two or more number of subgroup of population. So here the subgroups are nothing but, so simply here the population it should be split up into either two or more number of subgroups, but this subgroup which is also named as deme, right? So here the deme is nothing but subgroup of population. So these deme which are maintains their own gene pool, means here the gene pool is nothing but the total number of genes in particular species or in entire population is called gene pool. But whenever the genes are exchanged in between one deme to another deme, either it is like suppose B deme to D or D deme to C deme, so whatever it may be, finally the whenever the genes are exchanged in between the various subgroup of populations and they behave, means they are effectively behave as a population. But whenever the demes are isolated by a particular barriers, here this barrier is nothing but either it is a mutation or natural selection or genetic drift or whatever it may be, finally which are creates the separation or isolation in between one deme to another deme. But finally they can operate the independently in the two populations, and each can develop into a new distinct species. So it can finally forms the species. But at the same time here the now we discuss about the isolation mechanism. So generally the isolation mechanism term is the first time introduced by one of the scientists. He was called as Dobzhansky, right? Dobzhansky, he was the first time introduced the term as isolation mechanism. According to Dobzhansky, the any agents that hinders the interbreeding, of group of individuals. So here it is the in definition according to Dobzhansky, and at the same time he was first time uses the term as isolation mechanism. But after later Dobzhansky, another scientist, he was especially Stebbins. So the Stebbins, actually he was explains the process of isolated mechanism, and finally he wrote the one of the book That book name is called process of process of organic evolution. Process of organic evolution. So here this book is written by Stebbin. He was explain the entire the process of isolation mechanism, and later Stebbins, another scientist, he was named as Mayer. So this Mayer, according to Mayer, the isolating mechanism are biological properties, biological properties which prevents the which prevents the interbreeding of naturally in sympatric population. So here it is the definition of Mayer. So this, according to Mayer, simply the isolating mechanisms are biological properties, various type of biological properties which are preventing the process of interbreeding in naturally sympatric population. So here it is the a common isolating mechanism which are observed by Dobzhansky, Stebbins, Mayer, and etc. But now I discuss another one is called related to isolating mechanism types. So generally isolating mechanism types which are classified into two types. One is pre-mating isolating mechanism, and the second type is called post-mating isolation. Pre-mating and post-mating, these are the two various type of isolation process. At the same time, this pre-mating isolation, which is also named as pre-zygotic isolation, and at the same time here post-mating isolation, which is also named as post-zygotic isolation. So means here these are the alternative names like post-mating or post-zygotic. At the same here the pre-mating is nothing but which prevents the means the organisms which are preventing the process of interbreeding by the especially which can prevent the copulation or fusion of gametes, like these gametes which are related to two different species which are nothing but interspecific crosses. So means here the pre-mating isolation which can defined as the which are prevents the copulation or fusion of gametes of interspecific crosses by the process of pre-mating isolation. And at the same second type post-mating isolation. So this post-mating isolation, if a pre-mating is fails, pre-mating is fails, then the post-mating isolation which can prevents the formation of hybrid. So here these are the another one which is also prevents the means the post mating barriers which are preventing the formation of hybrids, right? So these are the pre-mating isolations and post-mating. Okay, now here we are discussed clearly the types of isolating mechanism. So like the first one we are discuss the pre-mating isolation is also called so, and second one is called post mating isolation, pre-mating isolation and post-mating isolation. So pre-mating isolation is also named as pre-zygotic isolation, and here the post-mating isolation is also named as post-zygotic isolation. So finally the post-zygotic isolation which prevents the formation of hybrid, but here which prevents the process of copulation or fusion of gamete cells, right? So again this pre-mating isolation which are also again divisible into various types. Like the first one, the several barriers. So one of the barrier is called geographical barriers or geographical isolation, and the second one, which is related to spatial isolation, and third one, which is called seasonal, or which is also named as temporal isolation, and fourth one, ecological, which is also called habitat isolation, and fifth one, ethological. Ethological is also named as behavioral isolation, and sixth one, physiological isolation, and the last finally seventh type of pre-mating isolation is called mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation. So here these are the various type of pre-mating isolations. Like one is geographical isolation, and the second one spatial isolation, and third one temporal or seasonal isolation, and fourth one ecological, and fifth ethological, and sixth physiological, seventh mechanical isolation, right? And at the same time, here the post mating isolations, which are also divisible into various types of these. First one, which is regarding to gametic mortality, gametic mortality, and second type regarding zygote mortality, zygote mortality, and the third one, hybrid mortality, hybrid mortality, and the fourth one, hybrid sterility, hybrid sterility, and fifth one, hybrid breakdown, hybrid breakdown, and finally these are the various type of post mating isolations. Like one is gametic mortality, zygote mortality, hybrid mortality, hybrid sterility or hybrid breakdown. Here hybrid mortality, which is also named as inviability, hybrid inviability or hybrid mortality. So these are the various type of pre-mating and post-mating isolations, and finally now I am clearly discussed about each and every type of pre-mating and post-mating isolations. Okay, now first one, pre-mating type of isolation. The first type is called geographical isolation, geographical isolation, right? In this geographical isolation, the organisms are population which are isolated or separated by a geographical barriers, geographical barriers. So these geographical barriers, which are various type, either it is a mountains or rivers or deserts or ponds or whatever it may be, finally which are separates the one individual to another individual, which is a well suitable example like darwin's finches darwin's finches on galapagos islands. These are the good examples for a geographical isolation. And now we discuss second type, is called spatial isolation, is the second type of pre-mating isolation, in which this process the individuals or organisms are isolated by a one of the barrier is called a long distance. So this long distance which cannot favorable for the traveling of one individuals from the one area to another area. So that's why they are isolated from the now isolated from the by the process of long distance. The well suitable example is called spotted owl. So means here one of the owl which is located on northern region, which is not migrated towards to Mexican. So means here these are the two different type of spotted owls. So northern spotted owl which is not traveled towards to Mexican spotted owl region. So that's why finally the long distance which are creates the isolation. So that type of isolation is called spatial isolation. Okay, now we discuss third type of pre-mating isolation is called seasonal isolation, but which is also named as temporal isolation. Temporal isolation. So the breeding season means in this process the breeding season is a different breeding season of the breeding seasons are different. So that is indicates the or that is suitable for the process of temporal isolation. We are discuss with the one example, like one of the example is called American toad. American toad is nothing but one type of amphibian, but this American toad it breeds the in early rainy season. But at the same time another type of individual like fowler's toad. So this fowler's toad which is also breeds a particular season, but it is not same as American toad, but here this breeds about in nearly late rainy season. late Rainy season. So that's why so they are reproductively isolated. Here American toad and fowler's toad which are breeding seasons are different. So that's why it is named as temporal isolation. Okay, now I discuss another fourth type of pre-mating isolation is called ecological isolation. But this ecological isolation which is also named as habitat isolation. Habitat isolation, in which process of isolation the mating inability mating inability organisms between organisms of either it is a closely related or subspecies, closely related as species or subspecies, which prevents the which are subspecies are located at the same region, but habitat is different. habitat is different So that's why it is also called habitat isolation. So means the one individual is located in one region or one habitat, and another individual is located at another type of habitat. Okay, so this ecological habitat which is explained with the help of one example, like one of the snake or one of the reptilian is called thamnofish. But these thamnofish species are two varieties. So like one is the water dwelling individual water dwelling individual, and another habitat individual is called terrestrial thamnofish. Means here these two are located in two different type of habitats, and these two different type of habitating species which are isolated from one to another. So that's why this is called ecological or habitat isolation. Okay, now we discuss fifth type of pre-mating isolation is named as ecological isolation, but this ecological isolation is also named as behavioral isolation. So in which behavioral isolation, so the different so simple here, the different mating behaviors which prevents the one prevents the interbreeding process, prevents the interbreeding. So simple ecological isolation which is defined by different mating behaviors which are prevents the process of interbreeding. The for example, we can suppose we can take the males of different species of stickle box. Here the stickleback is nothing but here it is the one type of fish, and these have they are having the different modes of nest building formation, and at the same time courtship dancing behaviors which are also a good examples for the process of behavioral isolation. And sometimes singing process, and we can also observe in honeybees the waggle dance. So the waggle dance is also one of the behavioral isolation. So here it can also fifth or pre-mating isolation. Okay, now I discuss about the sixth type of pre-mating isolation is named as physiological isolation. So physiological isolation. So here the physiological isolation is nothing but same as the mating inability due to functional incompatibility is the major source for the creation of physiological isolation. So this physiological isolation which is a suitable example, like one individual is also Cinderella of genetics is called Drosophila, in which Drosophila species means that whenever in case of interspecific mating, the swelling of vaginal mucous membrane is the one of the physiological isolation. Swelling of vaginal mucous membrane. So here the last type of pre-mating isolation is called mechanical isolation. So this type of isolation occurs due to the difference in morphological structures like the well suitable example external reproductive organs or external genitalia, which are the is morphologically different in nature. But we can discuss with example like individual is called snails. So the snails, they are having the same species. If they are same species, the reproductive structures they are aligned on same, but snails from different species part other species means, so the same or similar species which are having the similar morphological structures, but the different species they are having the different types of or a difference in morphological structures. So this is the good example for mechanical isolation. And finally here these are the physiological and mechanical, and finally these are all are the various type of pre-mating isolations, right? Okay, now I'm discussing about the post-mating isolation. The post-mating isolations, which are also named as post-zygotic isolations, which are also again classified into 5 types mainly. Like first one is called gametic mortality, and second one zygote mortality. Third one hybrid inviability. Fourth, hybrid sterility, and fifth one hybrid breakdown. So these are all are the post mating isolation. So first one we discussing gametic mortality. Gametic mortality is the first type of post mating isolation. So in case of, so here the gametic mortality is nothing but if in case, so suppose the external fertilization is occurs, the sperm may be fails, maybe fail to the fertile of the egg due to unfavorable climatic conditions, of climatic conditions which cannot suitable for the fusion of sperm cell to the egg cell. So that is the case of external fertilization. At the same time, in case of internal fertilization, in case of internal fertilization, the sperm may be killed or immobilized by the presence of a female genital tract. So that's why which cannot forms the zygote. So here it indicates the gametic mortality. So this gametic mortality which is well seen in one of the individual, it is a complete marine invertebrate, is called sea cucumber. Sea cucumber is the one of the marine invertebrate individual. So these sea cucumbers which are releases their sperm cells and as well as oocytes into the surrounding water medium, but the sperm which can recognizes their own species gametes by the help of chemical markers chemical markers. So here it is the one type of post mating isolation is called gametic mortality. Okay, now we discuss second type of post mating isolation or post zygotic isolation is called zygote mortality. Zygote mortality. Here the zygote is nothing but it is a diploid condition, and this is the result of fertilization. And this zygote mortality in results it is death of zygote. So which is well seen in one of the example like in either sheep or goat. So which is the zygote mortality is nothing but death rate. So this death which is takes place in the zygote, so that is called zygote mortality, which is seen in sheep and as well as goat. Okay, third type of post mating isolation is called hybrid inviability. Inviability is nothing but they cannot live and they cannot develop. So in this process hybrid zygotes are hybrid zygote which can fail to develop as a embryo, as a embryo which is formed by, means the embryo is formed by interspecific crosses, and at the time of development the zygote is abort. So finally this is the hybrid inviability. So in which, in hybrid inviability, the zygote fails to, hybrid zygote which is fails to develop, so which is well seen in one of the example, like the hybrid which is formed in between the two type of species. One of the species is called rana pipens, rana which is commonly called leopard frog, and at the same time another individual is called rana sylvatica, so which is commonly named as wood frog. So in between which can forms the a hybrid, but these hybrid which cannot do not survive beyond the early gastrula stage. So early gastrula stage, here the gastrula stage is nothing but it is the embryonic development stage. At the time of embryonic development the hybrid which can turns to death or inviability, right? So this is the third type of hybrid inviability. Yes, fourth one is called hybrid sterility. Hybrid sterility is the fourth type of post mating isolation. In this case the most of the organism of hybrids, they are they are sterile due to incompatibility of chromosomes. Means here the hybrid which can shows the a particular number of chromosome, but the parents are also maintains the different type of chromosomes. So this are indicates the hybrid sterility. The well suitable example is called mule is produced by the mule is the one of the hybrid. So this hybrid individual which is produced by a cross in between male and mare. So finally it can leads to incompatibility of chromosomes. So this incompatibility of chromosome, it leads to hybrid sterility. So this is the another type of post mating isolation. Fifth one is called hybrid breakdown. Hybrid breakdown is also another type of post mating isolation. So in certain cases the hybrids in some cases or in certain cases hybrids are fertile, but the progeny means their offspring or their next generations are very abnormal, and they are also called sterile, abnormal or sterile. In other cases some very rarely the first generation of hybrids are viable, and they are also fertile, but majority of the cases the future generations are inviable. Future generations are inviable or sterile. So that's why they can't produces the another next generation. So here it indicates the hybrid breakdown, but this hybrid breakdown which is clearly discussed with the help of one example is called hybrids of lions. lion, lion. So and cross with tigers, hybrids which are crossed with the lion, and finally they can produces the one individual but these are have been obtained through the Jew breeding process or Jew breeding programs, and finally in which Jew breeding programs the first generations which are healthy, first generations are healthy, but hybrid become weak and sterile sterile in future generations. So here it is simply suitable for the hybrid breakdown process. Here this is the post mating isolation. Now I will discuss, right. So these are the finally various type of pre-mating isolations and post-mating isolations, but the finally the isolation has a particular significance. Now I am discussing about the significance of isolation. So in which first one, it maintains the means isolation, it maintains the distinctiveness of characters of species, which maintains the by the process of isolation, and at the same time it helps in accumulation of variations accumulation of variation. It leads to speciation, and at the same time this isolation process, it divides the population, and these populations which are also again divisible into subpopulations which will differ significantly from their ancestral generation or ancestral population, and these are also creates the finally the process of speciation. Here it is the significance of isolation, and thank you all.